everyone, and welcome to Pod TV's Economics with David M. Walker. Today, we just have a fabulous show planned for you. David visited the ALEC and spoke there, and we're going to play the video for you. I hope you enjoy it, and then we're going to have a panel discussion. Feel free to post your questions about it. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I'd like to provide a few facts to back up what the speaker and the chairman had to say. But before I do, let me note that after me, Representative Ken Ivory from Utah will be making some remarks. Ken is a longstanding member of Alec. He is a longstanding supporter of federalism and fiscal responsibility, and I look forward to hearing his remarks. Let me start with a few facts. Three very important actions took place in 1913 that had a profound effect on our country. Number one, the adoption of the income tax and the direct election of senators by constitutional amendment. And secondly, the establishment of the Federal Reserve. These three actions served to fuel the growth of the federal government, undercut states' rights, and enable the federal government to manipulate interest rates and self-deal in its own debt. As a result, today, the federal government is 10 times bigger as a percentage of the economy than it was in 1912, and still growing. Congress controls less than 30% of the annual direct spending budget, down from 97% in 1912. In addition, Congress controls zero of the $1.5 trillion in tax expenditures, and therefore, in total, when you add up both direct and indirect spending, Congress controls 10% of expenditures every year. What kind of budget is that? Congress has only passed annual appropriations bills by the beginning of the fiscal year 4 times in my lifetime. That is an F-. Federal debt to GDP has reached record levels and is still increasing. Total liabilities and unfunded promises of the federal government exceed $125 trillion, which is 5 times GDP and about $380,000 for every man, woman, and child in the United States, and growing. Believe it or not, interest is our fastest growing federal expense, for which we get nothing. And in less than 10 years, the Social Security and Medicare hospital insurance funds will be exhausted. And yet the leading presidential candidates for both major parties are saying, I won't touch Social Security and Medicare. Let me be clear, this is unacceptable and an example of laggardship rather than leadership, because doing nothing on Social Security means you cut benefits across the board 20% and rising in less than 10 years. I'm assuming that nobody here believes that the federal government's in good financial condition. So it's time to recognize reality. The federal government has grown too big, promised too much, subsidized too many, lost control of the budget, and undercut states' rights under the Constitution. Clearly, we are on a fiscally irresponsible and unsustainable path. In fact, every major federal fiscal and monetary agency has said that for several years, and yet nothing has been done. Failure to act is not an option because it's a direct threat to our future economic prosperity, national security, international standing, and domestic tranquility. The bad news will flow down to states and to us, we the people, if we don't act. Unfortunately, the debt ceiling has failed to constrain the growth of government and limit mounting debt burdens. Therefore, the only answer is a constitutional amendment that can constrain both current and future Congresses. Statutory approaches won't work. As I testified before the House Budget Committee earlier this year, 3 steps are necessary to defuse our ticking federal debt bomb. First, stop the bleeding. Cut spending for fiscal 2024 from the bloated levels of 2022 and 2023. Believe it or not, federal spending was 40% higher last year than pre-COVID levels. 40% increase in 4 years. Second, stabilize the patient. Create a statutory fiscal sustainability or debt commission that will educate and engage the American people on the facts, the truth, the tough choices, solicit input, and then make a package of recommendations for an up or down vote in Congress. As we heard from the Speaker and from the Chairman, there are bipartisan bills, and in fact, as of this very moment, there's a hearing occurring before the House Budget Committee where the sponsors of these bills are testifying, and I look forward to seeing those bills move forward. Third, cure the disease. Adopt a federal fiscal sustainability constitutional amendment that would limit the growth of government and cap debt to GDP at reasonable and sustainable levels, absent extraordinary circumstances. This third point is where you come in. Shockingly, in 1979, 39 states had active applications for a convention of states to propose a fiscal responsibility amendment, and Congress did nothing. Importantly, 30 of these 39 were limited to fiscal responsibility only, thereby providing a critical safeguard against a so-called runaway convention, which is the primary objection that people raise to a convention of states. Despite this fact, Congress has failed to act, and as a result, this is both unacceptable and unconstitutional. The Federal Fiscal Sustainability Foundation, of which I'm a board member, has financed the drafting of a declaratory judgment filing by a prominent D.C. firm with significant Supreme Court experience. Several states are considering whether to file the case against the Congress to right this wrong. This case would have to be decided by the Supreme Court, which is conservative, and this is our best chance to right this wrong, is to get a case before the Supreme Court to force the Congress to discharge its constitutional responsibilities. We need more states to join this effort. Thank you. If you want to learn more about this effort and what you can do to protect your state's interest and to help save our future, please attend the breakout session at 9:15 at Trailblazers D and E. In closing, let me remind you two things from history. When George Washington made his farewell address, he issued 4 warnings. They were avoid excessive debt, avoid foreign wars, avoid regionalism, and avoid factionalism. How we doing? Second, Rome arguably was the greatest superpower in history. It was a republic for about 500 years, and then it fell and became an autocracy for another 500 years. Rome fell for several reasons. They included fiscal irresponsibility, political instability, moral decline, an overextended military, and inability to control its borders. Do those sound familiar? We must learn from history and others and take the necessary steps to create a better future. We, the people, are responsible and accountable for what does or does not happen in Washington. In the final analysis, we have 3 choices: to accept the status quo, to quit, or to fight. I choose to fight, and I hope you join me. Thank you, and I hope to see you in the breakout session. Ken Ivory, Representative Kim Ivory.
And there again, here at Pod TV, David M. Walker, he doesn't just talk, he walks his talk. He walks it straight to Washington, and he tells them what we need to do to become more sustainable and to maintain our superpowership. And as we all know, sometimes history has a tendency of repeating itself. And you know what? I think David's right. We can either just accept it, or we can fight and make the change. And let's don't repeat history the wrong way. Let's get in there, let's fight, let's make the changes that are necessary. You know, go yourself to Washington and pitch your ideas. I'm sure someone out there has good solutions as well. But David has the experience to pull us through these troubled waters. And I want to introduce everyone to David M. Walker. Thank you, David, for joining us. And thank you so much for doing this for us. I appreciate it.
Happy to do it.
Yeah. So today we also have with us, all the way from California, James E., our chess master. We have Peter Bennett, our Wall Street hacker.
Thanks.
And we have Rick, Rosner. I'm not going to repeat his other name that he goes by, but
You can read it right down there.
he does our economic conversation late at night called Naked at Night. It's not just about him being painted in the nude and auctioning off the paintings, but they actually talk about our economic troubled waters and the things that are going on currently. All the way from down under, we have none other than Shaquille Latimer, who's also experienced in our financial institutions. And we will be having Mark Lee joining us here real soon. He will be your host. And of course, Sasha Starr will be joining us from Canada real soon. But meanwhile, let's get this conversation started. David, what was the reception like after you spoke?
We had a very positive reception. Somebody told me it was the first time ever that Alec members had clapped in a plenary session before. They had never done that before, which I thought was unusual. But following my talk, which obviously was very succinct, it's about 7.5 minutes, we had an hour and a half workshop where we went through all the details about what needs to be done, why it needs to be done, how it needs to be done, who needs to do it. And the real issue here is most people don't know is there's two ways to get a constitutional amendment. And we clearly need one in the fiscal area. One way is the old-fashioned way. 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate pass a proposed amendment. It's the same language. They then send it to the states, and 38 states have to ratify that amendment before it becomes part of the Constitution. We've got 27 amendments right now. They've all been done that way. The second way, which the founders, who were very bright people, recognized that, Congress might become so out of touch or so out of control that they might not propose amendments in areas that we really do need action. And therefore, they said that if 2/3 of the states, 34, file an application with the Congress to propose a convention of states that would propose one or more amendments. Now, this is important. Not a convention to rewrite the Constitution, a convention of states that would propose one or more amendments to the Constitution, then the Congress shall call the convention. Non-discretionary, ministerial, automatic. And I and a few others have done extensive research and were shocked to find that for the period 1979 through 1998, we had 34 or more states, a peak of 40 in 1983, that had active applications for a convention of states to propose a fiscal responsibility amendment. And yet Congress did nothing because they've never assigned responsibility of anybody to collect these, to store these, and to count these. And so one of the things that is likely to happen, in my view now, is several states are likely to file suit against the Congress, forcing them to deal with this issue. Either they can propose their own amendment, or they can call the convention, and the states will end up taking over. There are one other thing. There are other things that need to be looked at too. You can understand why Congress doesn't want to constrain its ability to spend and its ability to borrow. And as we all know, one Congress can't bind the next Congress. Statutory approaches like the debt ceiling and other approaches have not worked to constrain the growth of government, mounting debt burdens. So we have to have a constitutional amendment. There are other areas where we may need one. Things like term limits, things like campaign finance reform. These are issues that you realistically are not going to expect the Congress to do for obvious reasons. And so let's prove that this concept can work, that it can be effective. And in our view, if you don't put your finances in order, nothing else matters. And so let's do first things first and do a fiscal responsibility amendment that would likely focus on debt to GDP, not a balanced budget. stabilizing debt to GDP at a reasonable, sustainable level by a date certain in the future, in a way that would constrain the growth of government. The Swiss did something called a Swiss debt brake, earlier this century, and it was adopted and ratified by 85% of Swiss citizens. Their system is different than ours. They have a referendum approach in their country. We don't. And so in our country, we've got to use the system that the Constitution provides. So let me just stop at that and open it up to others. And let's have a lively conversation here.
So how do you pull it off with all the polarization? Like, if I think that like liberal states would freak out at what conservative states might do. Like, that if you had like California might freak out that Arkansas might like put up an amendment that makes abortion 100% illegal across the whole country or something.
All right, Rick, your point's well taken. First, what we want to do is that we want to have a convention of states for the sole purpose of proposing a fiscal responsibility amendment. And the number one argument against the convention of states to propose amendments is that it might run away. We have tried to deal with that several ways. Number one, in 1979, when we first crossed the finish line, they should have done their job. We had 39 active applications, 30 of which were fiscal responsibility only. The peak was 1983 when we had 40 and 32 were fiscal responsibility only. Now, let me tell you why that's significant. When you have a convention of states, it's one state, one vote. That's the long-standing history and precedent of convention of states. And therefore, if a majority of the states, which as you know would only be 26, if a majority of the states have agreed in advance that they want to limit the convention to a particular topic, everything else is ruled out of order. And so we've taken great care to make sure that a majority of the applications are fiscal responsibility only, which gives the ability to limit the scope of the convention. But the second thing that you have to keep in mind is the biggest hurdle is ratification. So let's say the Congress calls the convention. The convention is limited to fiscal responsibility only. It's still got to be ratified by 38 states. Or if somebody tried to run away, it still has to be ratified by 38 states. And if you look at the political makeup, there's no way that you're going to get something crazy, either far right or far left, that's going to be adopted by 38 states. It's just not going to happen. But our point is, let's don't even get there. Let's make sure that it's constrained to fiscal responsibility only, so that we don't have to get there. And if this works, then if somebody wants to do one for term limits, or somebody wants to do one for campaign finance reform or whatever, then so be it. We would have proved the concept, and that's what's important. Look, if the Supreme Court doesn't force the Congress to do this, and I think they would, but only the states have standing to sue. If they don't, you basically have mooted the states' rights under Article 5 of the Constitution. And they've already been undercut too much already. James?
What states do you think will do the lawsuits?
Well, we have one state that's already publicly said that they're ready to go. That's Utah. Then we have other states that are actively considering joining them. We want several states to go at the same point in time. And my personal view is, Rick, is that once it's filed, a bunch of states will jump on. But guess what? They're overwhelmingly going to be red states. The blue states don't want to constrain the growth of the government. And they also don't want to take a chance on the money they're getting from the government to be slowed down. And so this is overwhelmingly a red state initiative, but not exclusively.
But the red states tend to get more money per capita from the government, at least that's what I'm told, than the blue states.
It's facts and circumstances. That may be the case in some. A lot of that has to do with things like where the military base is. Okay. For example, Texas has a lot of military bases. Florida has a lot of military bases. California does too. But then there are other issues as to where is there more poverty, to the extent that you're talking about welfare programs, and they're geared towards that. But a lot of the states want balanced budget amendments. I don't believe that makes sense at the federal level for lots of different reasons. Okay. Plus, you got to keep in mind 49 of 50 states have a balanced budget requirement. And we got a bunch of states that are basket cases because they define balanced budget, including the one that Peter's sitting in right now, Connecticut.
That's true.
The way they define balanced budget is cash flow. So they've got huge unfunded pension, retiree health obligations, and other things that they don't count as balancing the budget.
As the federal government does, which is the worst problem of all.
Right. And it doesn't have a balanced budget requirement, right? But we need something.
Right. I'd like to jump in with a question.
Hey, we've had our hands raised.
Hold on a second, Peter. Shaquille is up next.
Yeah.
Okay. I didn't know we go in order.
Jim's up next, and then it's me.
Okay.
He's had his hand up for longest.
Thank
So
you.
Jim, thanks.
Dave, I wanted to just congratulate you on your presentation and all of the things that you're working on. It's a real act of patriotism on your part, in my opinion, and I'm very proud to know you. I have a couple of quibbles, and some things that I really would like your feedback on. One is you mentioned the 1913 Federal Reserve. It was created in 1913, but we had a national bank at the origins because once we created the country, we had absorbed an enormous amount of debt. And Andrew Jackson in the 1820s ran against it and dismantled it. So there's a lot of history prior to 1913 about this that I just wanted to call people's attention to. And managing our debt has been a 200-year issue. But the other thing that I wanted to say is that you're happy about the prospects of going to the Supreme Court, but you mentioned it was a conservative court, but I don't think conservative means what it once did, and I am very suspect of the motivations of some of the people on the court now in terms of favoring the wealthy, and that was Andrew Jackson's primary objection, was that the national bank was going to not be for the people but for the wealthy, and so, we want to keep those things in mind. I'm very, very much in favor of a states' rights convention. One thing an observation I would make, I'm not sure I object to it, is that one state, one vote doesn't represent the general population very fairly at all. And, and the other thing is I was kind of happy when this happened to me, but they stopped taking Social Security taxes out of my paycheck when I got to a certain income level. And why? Just keep that tax. Let me pay. The more money I make, the happier I should be to pay that tax, because, it's progressively less of a hindrance to my lifestyle. But we're taxing the people that make less money to pay for Social Security. So that's one way of easily getting more income to help with the Social Security. And the last thing I would say, when we were under Eisenhower, the tax rate was very, very different. And, we didn't have these kinds of problems. It's too simplified. I oversimplified it, but, it may be a more progressive tax as part of the overall solution as well. But I do think that forcing the Congress to act and calling them to account, I'm just very proud of the battle that you're fighting. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Jim. Let me come back on your comments, and then we'll go to the next person. First, the only time in the history of the United States the federal government has been debt-free is when Andrew Jackson was president of the United States. And it will never happen again, nor does it need to happen, but we need to constrain debt to reasonable levels and yes, also make sure that interest is reasonable as a percentage of budget. Secondly, look, the Fed has the ability to set interest rates, and it, in recent years has been aggressive about self-dealing in our debt. In other words, buying trillions of dollars of debt rather than going to the market. which keeps rates down in the short term, but has the potential to make them higher in the future when they unwind that. That clearly, we need constraints on that. That's out of control. Okay. Thirdly, the word I probably should have used for the Supreme Court rather than conservative is constitutionalist. A majority of the Supreme Court are constitutionalists. And this language is very clear, and that's why I feel confident that it gets to them, that the states' rights will be upheld. In addition, on Social Security, I think one of the likely reforms to Social Security is significantly increasing the taxable wage-based cap. Maybe not eliminating it, but significantly increasing it, which is what happened in 1983 under the Social Security compromise that occurred in 1983. And the last thing is on taxes. Look, everything's got to be on the table. Mandatory spending, discretionary spending, and revenues. Everything's got to be on the table. Everything's going to be affected to one degree or another, but everything's not equal. All right. When you look at the numbers, spending is much higher as a percentage of GDP post 1980 average than revenues. And so we're going to have more revenues, but we're going to have to constrain spending to a much greater degree than on the revenue. And yes, we need to make sure that our tax code is progressive, while at the same point in time, I would argue you shouldn't have 45% of tax filers pay zero income tax, and 20% of tax filers actually get money back, not because they paid too much, because they have refundable tax credits. But anyway, so let's go on. Who's next?
Shaquille is next, but there was a couple of questions from Lee. Can I answer those questions before you come up, Shaquille? Is that okay by you?
Fine, Lee's here, though. Why don't you just bring him up?
He didn't want to come up by face, but he did ask him. Let me see if I've got him by face. If he wants to ask him directly and everything, otherwise I can translate them and everything. But they're in the chat. He was asking what will force the federal government to listen to the Convention of States. They can just ignore it, much as they ignore the Constitution, as the way he's feeling. And then he's also asking you by what logic should there be a cap on financial withholdings?
All right.
Social Security withholdings.
Social Security withholdings. Right. My fault. Thank
you. First, you're going to have to sue Congress in order to get action here. There's pretty much broad-based agreement on that. And as I said before, only the states have standing to sue under Article 5. And only the Supreme Court can resolve this issue. That's the highest court of the land. They're the ones that are the ultimate interpreters of the Constitution. I wish we didn't have to go that route, but I think it's necessary under the circumstances. As far as the cap, you got to keep in mind that Social Security is a social insurance system. Okay, everybody pays based upon wages and self-employment income, and there's always been a cap. The question is, what is the cap? Back in 1983, the cap was raised significantly to be able to cover, 90% of wages. If we did that today, the cap would would roughly double from what it is right now. Okay. Some say, well, why don't you eliminate the cap, which is what we did for Medicare. But Medicare is 1.45%. And Social Security is 6.2, and wealthy people get less replacement rate for their benefits than people that are near the poverty level. We're going to have to get more money from wealthy people. Don't get me wrong. The question is how best to do it. You can reform Social Security and make it solvent, sustainable, secure by raising the cap, looking at the benefit formula, looking at the cost of living formula, looking at retirement eligibility ages, making changes in those areas, and make it solvent, sustainable, secure indefinitely, and exceed the expectation of every generation of Americans, because young people don't think they're going to get anything, and they're wrong. And seniors think that they're going to get taken advantage of. There are other words I could use, but I won't. And they're not. That's not true. And so we've got a way to make this work and exceed the expectation of every generation of Americans if we can get something that's the biggest deficit in Washington, and it's called a leadership deficit. Next.
Shaquille.
A lot of things have been covered before I've spoken. I'll just maybe address the last couple, especially ones where I don't agree with Dave, because I think Dave knows that I agree with him on about 95% of the things that he says. Great speech, by the way. I actually grabbed that off your LinkedIn earlier in the week and watched it a couple of times. So, and I'm a big fan of Alec. So, look, I think when you look at taxes in the US, I don't think taxes are a part of America, I think, or a part of government. I think it's the only part that really matters. If you have a look at all of history, all of the revolts over history have all been about taxes, whether it be the American revolts, whether it be what happened in France, the Magna Carta, all of those things. My personal opinion is that Social Security in the United States as a department should just be phased out altogether. I don't think it works. And I think if you compare it to your peer group, it's just something that doesn't work. Australia had a similar system. We introduced superannuation contributions, 9% from your employer on top of your wages, and you can top it up voluntarily. You can use taxes then on those monies in order to help those people that don't have enough. But I think that lifting the cap so that wealthier people are just contributing more and more to something that they're getting an ever smaller return on, one, I don't think it's a very good idea, even if you could do it. But the second thing is that wealthy people aren't often earning very much money. They're earning money from assets. Their assets are increasing in price. So what would you tax? So I think that imbalance and that suggestion just sort of adds to the already existing issue. You've already got the most progressive rates of tax in the Western world, and you experience the same problem. You experience a problem where very wealthy people, some of them are paying a lot, but not for very long, because then they will go and get accountants and all that to sort themselves out. And very wealthy money, especially old money, are just not contributing very much. So I don't think that's a good solution. But I think that your general talks about more fiscal responsibility in Washington, I think, is very important. I hope that the rest of the world, the rest of the West, actually follows the United States in this idea of let's be fiscally responsible. Let's get back to it. Well, just one question I'll just ask you very quickly, Dave. Sorry to go on for too long. I'm somewhat curious. So when I first came across Alec, I was like, what's a federalist? What's an anti-federalist? So I started reading up on that when I was in my 20s. Just somewhat curious, would you think that if you were successful in getting the amendments that you want and get the changes that you want, would there be the potential that blue states, red states, as was referred to earlier, might actually increase their state debts in order to provide some of these services that the federal government's no longer providing, because they would have the belief that they'll always get bailed out by the federal government? Is that a risk?
All right, several things. On Social Security, you got to keep in mind one thing, that any kind of reform that requires legislation, a test that it has to meet. There's lots of tests, but there's one particular. It's called political feasibility. You have to be able to pass the House, get 60 votes at least in the Senate, unless you can do it on budget reconciliation, which is simple majority, and a signature of the president. I do believe that next time we go after Social Security, there's going to be a look at trying to do something as a supplement to the defined benefit Social Security for those people who don't have a private pension plan. And I understand how Australia works, and I think that's largely been very successful. And I don't think it's something that we ought to reject, but you got to keep in mind political feasibility. Secondly, you make a good point that the wealthiest people don't make money based on wages. They don't even make it on self-employment income, which is subject to social insurance taxes. They make it on investments. And that's why if you really want to get more in assets, and if you really want to get more money out of the wealthy, the top 1%, 2% or whatever, you've got to look at the tax code as it relates to that. And I think that will be on the table. The third thing is that the average state gets 35% of its revenues from the federal government. And what ultimately is likely to happen is you're likely to have more devolution, where more responsibility and authority will be given to the states, and where the federal government might end up providing some financial assistance, but maybe based on a block grant approach. And so the state's got some skin in the game too. And if the state wants to do more than what the minimum standard is that's set by the federal government, they can do it, but it's their money, and they have to make that decision, based upon, the will of their people and those who represent their people. Next, please.
Can I just make one quick supplementary point there? Is that okay with everyone?
Yeah, go ahead.
I got a couple questions. One is, it seems like, and I might be wrong, but the Roman Empire and America have been able to paper over a lot of the rot and dysfunction economically during periods of growth. So can you talk about growth? That's thing one. Thing two is, can you pull this off as with the news media doing such a bad job of helping people have financial knowledge and literacy?
Okay, first, when I did the 10,000 mile, 27 state national fiscal responsibility bus tour in 2012, that was funded largely by H. Ross Perot Sr., may rest in peace. Alice Rivlin, may she rest in peace, who was the first director of CBO, head of OMB, vice chairman of the Fed. I'm right of center. She was left of center. We did a lot of citizen education engagement work, and we got 77 to 97% agreement on a whole range of reforms covering all the major items that would have to be done as part of this commission effort, right? And one of the things that we did was we started off, after people agreed way over 90% that this is a problem, we need to do something sooner rather than later. Everything needed to be on the table, but not everything is equal. After we got them to agree on a debt to GDP goal, all right, the fact that it was primarily a spending problem, but not exclusively a spending problem, we then got them to agree on 6 principles and values that would guide decision-making. In other words, whatever reforms we made, we would want to make sure that they're consistent with a set of principles and values that brought people together rather than divided them apart. And those were, number one was pro-growth. Since the metric was debt to GDP, you want to have pro-growth policies, whether it be tax, regulatory, whatever, pro-growth policies, because if you can grow the denominator faster than the numerator, you're making progress, even if the numerator is going up. And by the way, that's what happened after World War II. We didn't pay down debt. We just grew the denominator much faster than the numerator. However, based on where we are now, based on known demographic trends, based on rising healthcare costs, based upon a declining percentage of global GDP, we're not going to be able to do that again. We want pro-growth, but we're going to have to make tough choices. So we talked about socially equitable, culturally acceptable, mathematical integrity, politically feasible, and meaningful bipartisan support. And I can go into that later if you want. And all of the reforms had to be consistent with those principles. And we got 77 to 97% agreement from representative groups of voters in 2 major swing states on packages of reforms that would accomplish the objective. Last comment, the people are way ahead of the politicians. Once you give them the facts and the truth, and once you bring them into the process, they can help set the table for a tough vote in Congress and provide cover for people who vote for it, because they know we can't continue doing what we're doing. Peter, you've had your hand up for a while.
No, thank you. I appreciate that, Dave. So what you were talking about, Dave, and several of the panelists were talking about were the division in our country, that you'll never get 38 states, that we have the red and the blue states. This is obvious, but this is the question I brought to the table today, which is, to me, one of the key overriding issues, and that is, how can it be that politicians and citizens either cannot or refuse to grasp the enormity of the issue? And in terms of theory, I have a theory that it could partly be because the human mind cannot process the almost unfathomable numbers of the national debt, not to mention in other countries what's coming, because we're talking about trillions. Trillions is not an easy concept to grasp. So I'd like to just throw out 2 ways that I would possibly show some perspective on how much money we really owe. And number one is just to say the numbers. Well, David, you talk about $125 trillion, but everybody's worrying about the 33 trillion, first of all, on the books, when the unfunded liabilities are the really big piece. And also, if you look at usdebtclock.org, they say the unfunded liabilities alone are 212 trillion. That's what they say the unfunded liabilities are. So how do we put this in perspective? Number one, we're talking about how do we put 212 trillion or 125 trillion in perspective? Number one, the S&P 500 is in its entirety based on, this is all based on Google researches. This week I didn't, double check, but I'm pretty sure these are accurate from what I've heard before. So the S&P 500 is worth about 36 trillion. The all U.S. privately held real estate combined, we're talking about land and houses, is worth 14 trillion. The entire U.S. bond market is 51 trillion. So first of all, 125 trillion or 212 trillion dwarfs all three of those combined. And another footnote on that is the entire world bond market is estimated at $126 trillion. We're talking about the entire debt of the world. So maybe that puts things in perspective. The only other way I would put it in perspective is the following. The U.S. debtclock.org says that we're talking about $631,000 per citizen in the United States. So that if I were to walk around in every neighborhood in the United States and I was to say, okay, you're a single person, I need a check, money order, or a promissory note, but you really have to pay this, $631,000, and then I walk into a home and say, oh, you have a family of four. I just need a check right now for $2.4 million. Or you can write me a promissory note, but you have to really significantly start paying that down. That is just two ways where you can start making it real and saying, this is a real problem. And those neighborhoods would collapse. So that's some ideas.
Let's talk about perspective. When I talk to people who don't know as much about this information, okay, or even sometimes people who do, you're right. You have to put it in perspective. And I normally talk about, for example, 125 trillion is 5 times total GDP. And then I talk about how much is it per person? How much is it per household? How does that compare to median household income? How does that compare to average net worth? So you're right. And that gets people attention because they can't deal with trillions. And I agree with that. That's important. But with regard to that clock that you're looking at, okay, that's not official government data. And the only thing I can say is what they're probably doing for the 212 trillion, they're probably using an infinity number rather than the 75-year number that's in the financial statements of the U.S. government. And when and my comeback on that is don't use the infinity number. And let me tell you why. Okay. Number one, that's the end of time. Tell me when the end of time is.
Of course.
Nobody has an answer to that question. Secondly, that's not the official numbers in the U.S. government financial statements, which are based upon a 75-year time horizon. You say, why? Because that covers everybody who's basically paying taxes, their lifespan, right, to 95, right, or 93. And the number is bad enough, right? So I don't need to make it worse than it is.
You're right.
I also don't be able to challenge my numbers. I want to say I can go to the financial statements and show you the numbers. Right?
So the only one follow-up question I'd have is then how can, whether you're in a blue state or a red state, whatever your political perspective, you care about the country, how can anybody not realize how significant this issue is? And how can they ignore it? How can they fight it? How can they fight you?
They ignore it because their elected representatives ignore it. Okay, let's understand this. Politicians have become addicted to deficits and debt. They're addicted. It's an addiction. Okay.
Sure.
Secondly, their number one priority for most, not all, but for most, is to get reelected. Human nature being what it is, they want as much as they can get, and they want to pay as little as they have to pay. Right? So you combine all of those factors, you get where we are. But the people understand you can't spend more money than you make, charge it to the credit card, self-deal in your own debt without having some day of reckoning. And most people care about the country, and most people care about their kids, and they really care about their grandkids. And that's really what this is all about. It's about the future of the country, and it's about the future of our families. And that's the context in which you have to engage people on this. And then they come together for solutions. Rick?
You can do a lot of great hocus pocus with infinity math. I want to do a game show called Who Wants to Be a Billionaire? And if you win, you get $1,000 a year for 1,000,000 years. Very doable.
So I just want to come back, Dave. Just one's a cheap shot. You said you wanted more growth. They did. They grew the debt to GDP level. What's the problem? But no, look, I do want to come back to the Social Security issue again, not to belabor the point, but almost 30 years ago, you wrote a book about this, right? And in that book, you talked about the baby boomers or the baby busters being concerned about what their retirement is going to look like. I'm not necessarily suggesting that superannuation, the way we have it in Australia, would be the solution for the US, but I think something like that. One of the complaints we have here is that the superannuation funds are run by trade unionists, which have no qualifications in finance, and so you don't get great results. But I guess my point would be when the younger generation is faced with, there's going to be probably older retirement ages, there's going to be less benefits, all of those sorts of things. I think that, yes, we need to look after the people that are already in the system, that are already going to be relying on that system. But I think that the more that you can reduce government, the better off people are. Why not allow people to actually have some control over that almost 12% of their income, or 13% of their income, which is supposedly being invested on their behalf? And if you calculate what their return on investment is, it's not necessarily a comparative to how much they've contributed. And it's not a very good rate of return. So why not let people say, you know what, I would rather have my money invested in a mixture of bonds and the stock market or whatever it may be, real estate or whatever those things may be, instead of having government do it for them and doing such a poor job, given that it's failed for such a long period of time.
Part of the problem is a vast majority of American citizens are not very adept with regard to financial matters. We don't teach financial literacy in a vast majority of our states. Too many of them follow the bad example of government. And so the real issue is, do I believe that we ought to increase savings? Yes. Do I believe that individuals ought to have an opportunity to have some say over how that money is invested to be able to get a higher rate of return? Yes. But one of the things I also know is that Social Security is the foundation of retirement income security. It is a lifetime annuity that is indexed to inflation. It's not supposed to be the only form of retirement income. It's only supposed to be the foundation, which, like a house, you can't live just on the foundation. And so that's why we're supposed to have supplemental private pensions and savings arrangements, supplemental personal savings. So I do believe that we won't go to a full superannuation model, but I do believe that we will have more supplemental savings arrangements where the individual has control over how that's invested with a limited number of options, similar to our federal thrift savings plan, which, as you probably know, is the largest so-called 401k plan in the world. And does well.
Your peer group doesn't, well, I'll rephrase that. The peer group of the US, which appears to give older people greater security in their retirement, they tend not to have programs which are run by government like this. Normally, the government-run programs are a safety net. It seems to me the US is contributing a disproportionate amount of money into this program and getting really quite poor results. And I take your comment that the everyday person may not be able to manage that wealth very well, and that's true. That's why you can have insurance companies and advisors and all that sort of stuff to manage it for them. But surely the last people that should be saying the people can't be trusted is government, given how poorly they've managed it. Jimmy.
Okay, who's next?
Oh, I'm
Jimmy.
next. I had a very quick question, and it's actually on the opposite end of the spectrum because we've been talking about the middle class and the wealthy. And as you know, Dave, I'm in a right to work state. And with this state convention, I was wondering how you would be addressing the another part of the broken system, which is the welfare system. I've said on this show a couple of times that I'm actually a fan, and this sometimes shocks people on this network, that I'm somewhat of a fan of workfare and all along those lines. So I'd love to know your thoughts around that and whether that is something that would be included in the state convention. I'm also a fan to some degree because of certain industries that I'm in of tax credits. So I was wondering if it would cover tax credits because we know a lot of states use tax credits as well.
Two things. One, the Convention of States would be for the purpose of proposing a fiscal responsibility amendment, which would have to be ratified by 38 states. In all likelihood, the amendment would focus on stabilizing debt to GDP at a reasonable and sustainable level by a date certain, and might have an element that would constrain the further growth of the federal government as a percentage of GDP, which is similar to the Swiss debt brake. How that would get ratified is important. Our proposal is for it to get ratified by state conventions, not the National Convention of States, by state conventions of citizens that are pledged to vote for or against the amendment. That's that is provided for as an option under Article 5 of the Constitution, and it actually was used in order to repeal prohibition, which is the 21st Amendment. And the reason that we want to do it that way is because, as we've said, the people are way ahead of the politicians. We are absolutely confident that an overwhelming percentage of the American people would ratify any reasonable amendment that the states produced and sent to the states for ratification. We're confident of that. When you put it back in the politicians' hands, it's a different story. But on your issue, what about welfare reform? And these that would be the kind of issue that would be looked at as part of the fiscal commission, not the Constitution. In other words, what kind of changes are necessary with regard to spending? What kind of changes are necessary with regard to revenue generation in order to achieve the goal of getting debt to GDP down to a reasonable and sustainable level over time? Who's next?
I am. And
Jim, then Rick.
Yeah. And, one of the things I remember Senator Lloyd Benson of Texas in his debates with Dan Quayle say, I can give you an illusion of prosperity by writing a bunch of hot checks. And that always stuck in my mind because that's what we're doing. And but I wanted to refocus when we're talking about Social Security, you ask the question, are we a just society? And the answer is, how do you treat your neediest? So let's keep that in mind. That's the prime directive. And, how we do it, we can disagree on. And I just believe that there is a rational way of doing it, as Dave has been outlining for us. And, I used to describe myself as a financially conservative and socially liberal person until I read an editorial by then Senator Bill Bradley. It says you can't do it. You can't do it. You can't take care of these people and be financially conservative. You've got to be able to be creative. You've got to be able to not necessarily run up gigantic debts as we have, because we're just out of control, as Dave has mentioned a number of times. But you have to balance what is the primary directive of our society in America, and how do we take care of our neediest people in a financially solvent way. So it's not financially conservative, it's financially solvent, financially rational, that I would like to say. And the last question I have is about the Convention of States. You say it's just going to be on fiscal things, but isn't one of the things that we're talking about is reducing government bloat? And is that on the table at all?
Let me come to that. First, I co-chaired a study for the Carnegie Foundation with Bill Bradley. He's a very bright and capable guy. I have a lot of respect for him. Secondly, you're talking about the last issue that you raised are issues again that would have to be addressed by the commission. All right, and refresh memory on your second question.
Well, basically, I would like to rephrase the discussion to say,
Okay, I got you.
Yeah.
Keep in mind there are 6 principles. The second principle after pro-growth is socially equitable. You need a solvent, sustainable, secure social safety net for those who are truly in need. All right? But you don't want that safety net to be such that it disincents work.
Right.
Or
Sure.
or disincents keeping the family together, which a lot of our systems do.
Yeah,
Right
they're
now.
irrational.
Yeah. Who's
Can I,
next?
can I
I
just make
mean,
a comment
okay,
on
so
that?
Rick is next.
the U.S. did pretty well after World War II because we had half of the world's manufacturing because the rest of the world was in ruins. Now, McKinsey says that AI will double the world's GDP. How does your program mesh with an effort to make sure the U.S. gets a huge chunk of the new tech-based industries of the future?
Well, the question is that while it might significantly increase GDP, what share of that GDP are we going to get, right?
Right. Yeah. How do we get it?
I understand that. And that's part of the issue of pro-growth, but I would respectfully suggest that's beyond the scope of the Constitution. and the other thing is, the other thing is that if this commission gets created, which I hope and pray it will, and if it gets created, I hope to be on it. Okay. It's only going to have a certain amount of time to be able to do what it needs to do, which includes massive public education engagement. So I think we're going to have to be realistic about how much we can take on with that period of time. But I hear you, Rick. What's next?
You know what? Let me just throw one little footnote in my opinion. AI is going to have obviously profound impacts on GDP, but also it's going to affect the need for human capital. And so in a way, this favors the United States over some other countries where they have inexpensive labor. Because now when you have robots to replace workers in other countries, that actually tends to shift the possible prosperity in the United States towards the United States.
That's a way complicated subject beyond the scope
It
of
is.
this.
I just wanted to throw that in, that I think that's going to help us in a way, but then unemployment is another issue, so it is extremely complicated.
But part of all right. Bottom line, aggregate, global, we're going to need less human labor that's unskilled. All right. We're going to need more skilled labor. And a lot of that has to do with how good your education system, how good your training system. And quite frankly, we're below average. We're below average. Okay. At post-secondary, university level, we're one of the top 3. But K through 12, we're not top 25. And that's a problem. That's a difference.
Just really quickly, because we're geared to wrap up and everything, but I think Jacoby had a quick question, and Travis, who's also joined us from Australia, may have a question as well if he wants to join in. But those will be the last two. As
Keep it short. I'll give you a short answer.
You're muted.
I can't hear you.
Jacoby, you're muted.
I pushed mute again. But just to tap into what Peter and I think it was someone else had talked about AI, because the commission AI right now. So, for example, the IDF used AI in the Israeli war currently. They started using that. And then the U.S. Commerce Department stopped the NVIDIA sale of AI chips to China. So in terms of AI, how can that be a focus, a imperative focus of not only the education system, but as well as the project that you're putting together, or the group?
Yeah, my view, Jacoby, is that's a subject that's big enough, important enough, and complicated enough to be able to address standing alone. I mean, I think it's something.
David, if I could interrupt, I just have one word: free market capitalism. If we have the countries that are going to have free market capitalism are the ones that are going to thrive in this new environment.
Yeah, I agree with you. But Free
if I
market
can
And
define it-
education, of course, education.
free
If I
market
can-
capitalism is not one word unless you bundle. What's
And education, of course. That,
if I can just come back to the
that's a
economics.
play on an ad that's running right now. So
Just really quickly, and then we'll get ready to wrap up
State
everything.
Farm.
Travis, you joined us also from Australia.
Travis,
Do you
what
have
do you
any
got, bud?
thoughts or anything that you wanted to add as we get ready to wrap
So-
up? But Travis,
There's a couple of similarities that I find between Australia and US. It's like you guys lead, then we follow very closely behind. And this is one thing that's always confused me, why the politicians do this. So I just want to bring you back to where you're talking about where your growth is bigger than your expenditure, keeping more money in and stopping money from leaving the country. So why doesn't America look at, and Australia's got the same problem as well, why don't they make America a tax haven for Americans? Because when you get to a certain point, you start looking offshore for all the tax havens to send money offshore. So you're not paying massive levels of tax. You don't have the red tape that's associated with it. So is this something that is actually being looked at? Is this on the table for trying to solve these sort of issues as well? Because I don't know about America, but we lose billions and billions of dollars in tax revenue because the income's earned in a different country. It's not earned in Australia.
Well, we have a unified tax system, and you get a credit for what you pay overseas. So our system is different, and it is a subject of some controversy, and would be within the scope of consideration of any commission if a commission is created. But I think we're at the end of the time.
we are at the
Thank
end of
you,
the
Dave.
time. We're going to end the show. This has been a great discussion, Dave. I'm glad to help Kim moderate it and everything. But you
Thank you
did
for
a
joining
great
us.
job as always, and I have a great deal of respect for you. And I look forward to seeing you again next Monday. One of these times you're going to have to take me on one of these DC trips with you, and all along those lines, because I always
Thanks,
enjoy those
everybody,
trips.
for participating. Appreciate it.
Thank
No
you.
problem.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
hey, good show, Mark.